He was about to fire her, but in less than 10 minutes, she would become the only person his child could survive on. The pen hovered just inches above the paper as Kang Ji-hyun sat behind a desk carved from dark walnut. The city of Seoul stretching beneath him in cold blue light, his expression unreadable, his decision already made. 10 names listed neatly in black ink, 10 lives about to be erased with a single signature, and somewhere deep in the mansion, beyond layers of glass and silence, a baby cried, not softly, not weakly, but with a raw, relentless desperation that had been echoing for hours. The kind of cry that didn't fade, didn't tire, didn't give up. It clawed at the walls, it seeped through marble floors, it found its way into bones, and still, no one could stop it. Not the trained nanny who had quit that morning, not the imported formula flown in overnight, not the specialists who had come and gone with quiet, careful voices and empty solutions. Nothing worked, nothing stayed, and the child, his son, refused every bottle placed against his lips, pushing away nourishment like it was foreign, like it didn't belong. And for the first time in years, a man who controlled entire districts with a word found himself sitting in silence, listening to something he couldn't command into submission, his jaw tightening just slightly as the cry rose again, sharper this time, cutting through the room like glass. And downstairs on the polished floors of the service corridor, Mai froze mid-step, her fingers still wrapped around a damp cloth, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, her chest tightening, her breath catching, and beneath the thin fabric of her uniform, something warm and undeniable stirred, a response she had been trying to ignore for weeks, ever since she left her 2-month-old baby in a small apartment miles away, ever since she told herself she had no choice, that survival required distance, that love could wait, but the human body did not understand logic. It understood need. And right now, somewhere above her, a child was crying in a way her body recognized instantly, deeply, painfully, her grip on the cloth tightening as another wave of sound reached her, longer this time, more desperate, and she closed her eyes for just a second, just one, but it was enough for memory to slip in, for the echo of her own baby's cries to surface, for the ache she carried quietly to press against her ribs. And when she opened her eyes again, the hallway felt smaller, quieter, like everything else had stepped back to make space for that one sound. And then she remembered the rules, the ones whispered on her first day, the ones no one dared to break. Never go to the 3rd floor, never touch the child, never interfere, especially not with him. And yet, the cry came again, louder, thinner, like something running out. And somewhere upstairs, a door closed sharply, footsteps pacing, then stopping, then nothing, just the cry again, filling the silence that followed. And in that moment, standing alone in a house that didn't belong to her, Mai felt something shift, not in the world around her, but inside herself, something older than fear, stronger than rules, quieter but impossible to ignore, and slowly, almost without realizing it, she set the cloth down, her hands trembling just slightly as she turned toward the staircase, her feet moving before permission could catch up, each step soft against the carpet, each second stretching longer than it should. And above, the crying continued, waiting for something or someone who hadn't arrived yet. The staircase felt longer than it had any right to be, each step absorbing the sound of her movement, until even her own breathing seemed too loud, too noticeable. And yet the crying above did not fade. It only sharpened, cutting through the quiet like a signal that refused to be ignored. And by the time I reached the top, her hands were no longer steady, her fingers pressing into the railing as if grounding herself to something real, something certain, because nothing about what she was about to do had permission attached to it. The 3rd floor stretched out in front of her like a boundary she had already crossed, soft lighting lining the walls, paintings that meant nothing to her. And at the end of the hallway, 2 men stood outside a closed door, both in dark suits, both alert, both visibly tired in a way that came from listening to something they could not fix, their eyes shifting toward her the moment she stepped closer, confusion flickering across their faces because she did not belong here, not in this part of the house, not near that door. And one of them straightened slightly, his voice low, controlled, telling her she should not be here, that no one was allowed inside, that the boss had given clear instructions, but before the words could fully land, the cry came again from behind the door, louder this time, thinner, like something unraveling, and it changed the room, it changed the air, it changed the look in their eyes, because even they, trained to follow orders without hesitation, could hear what was happening. And for a brief second, no one spoke, no one moved, and I felt it again, that pull, deeper now, undeniable, her body responding in a way that bypassed thought, bypassed fear, and she met their eyes, not with defiance, not with confidence, but with something quieter, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood, and when she spoke it was soft, almost fragile, but steady, telling them she could help, not explaining how, not offering proof, just stating it as truth. And for a moment, the men hesitated, exchanging a glance that carried more weight than words, because this was not their decision to make. And yet the crying behind the door did not stop. It did not wait for permission. It demanded it. And finally, one of them stepped back, just half a step, not a gesture of approval, but not refusal either. And that was all it took, my reach for the handle. Her fingers pausing for just a second, as if asking one last silent question. And then she turned it, the door opening into a room that looked nothing like the rest of the house, softer, warmer, filled with things meant for comfort that were not working. A crib positioned near the center, blankets carefully arranged, toys untouched, and in the middle of it all, the baby, small, restless, his face flushed from crying, his tiny hands clenched as if holding on to something that was not there, and nearby, a bottle sat abandoned, half full, rejected, just like the others. And for a second, everything slowed, the sound of the crying still there, but distant now, like it was waiting, and I stepped forward, her movements instinctive, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, her arms lifting as she reached for him. And the moment she held him, something shifted, not silence, not yet, but a change subtle, immediate, as if the world had adjusted by a fraction, and she felt it, that connection, not built on time or permission, but something older, something that did not need to be taught. And as she held him closer, her breath steadying, her hands no longer shaking, the room seemed to pause with her, waiting for what she would do next. The baby's cries did not stop all at once. They did not vanish like a switch being flipped. Instead, they softened by degrees, each breath less strained than the last, each small movement less frantic, and I could feel in her arms, the tension slowly releasing from his tiny body, as if something inside him had finally recognized what it had been searching for, and she lowered herself into the chair beside the crib without thinking, her movements guided by instinct rather than decision, her heart beating faster, now not from fear, but from something deeper, something she had been holding back for weeks. And as she looked down at him, really looked this time, she saw more than just her employer's child. She saw need, raw and simple, the kind that did not understand rules or status or boundaries, and her hands trembled just slightly as she adjusted her hold, her breath catching as reality pressed in around her, because she knew what her body was asking her to do. She knew what this moment required, and it was the one thing she had promised herself she would never bring into this house, never let be seen, never let become part of this life she had built out of necessity. But the baby shifted again, his small face turning instinctively toward her, searching, and that was when the last piece of hesitation broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like something giving way after holding too much for too long, and she closed her eyes for just a second, just enough to steady herself before she made the decision. Careful, deliberate, guided entirely by care rather than impulse. She created a private space, shielding him with the softness of her posture, ensuring dignity, ensuring respect. And as she did, the room seemed to hold its breath, the air still, the light unmoving, as if even the house itself understood the weight of what was happening. And then, finally, the crying stopped. Not faded, not reduced, but stopped, replaced by a quiet that felt almost unreal after hours of sound. And I felt it immediately, the change in him, the way his body relaxed completely for the first time, the way his small hands unclenched, the way his breathing settled into something steady, something peaceful, and tears slipped down her face before she even realized they were there, not from sadness, not entirely, but from the release of something she had been carrying alone, something that now had purpose again. And for a moment, everything else disappeared, the rules, the job, the consequences, all of it fading into the background as she focused only on the child in her arms, the quiet connection that needed no explanation, no permission, just presence, just care. And somewhere down the hallway, footsteps approached, slow, measured, unmistakable, the kind of steps that did not rush because they never needed to. And the door behind her opened without warning, the sound sharp in the stillness, and Maya's entire body froze, her breath catching mid-inhale, her hands instinctively tightening just slightly around the baby, not in fear for herself, but in protection of him. And she did not turn immediately. She did not speak. She simply sat there, holding the child who was no longer crying, in a room that had finally gone silent. And then she felt it before she saw it, the presence behind her, heavy, controlled, watching, and when she finally lifted her eyes, just enough to glance toward the doorway, Kang Ji-hyun stood there, perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the child in her arms. And in that moment, no one spoke, no one moved, and the silence that followed was louder than anything that had come before. For a long moment, Kang Ji-hyun did not speak, did not step forward, did not interrupt what he was seeing, and that alone made the air in the room feel heavier, more fragile, as if a single wrong movement could break something that had just barely come back together, his eyes fixed on his son, not crying, not struggling, simply resting in a way he had not seen in hours, maybe days, and the stillness of it all felt almost unreal, like a scene that did not belong in a house built on control and precision, and I could feel his presence behind her like a shadow that carried weight. Not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable, her heartbeat rising again, not for what he might do, but from what this moment meant, because there was no explanation she could give that would make this acceptable, no words that could undo what she had already done. And yet she did not move, she did not pull away, because the child in her arms had finally found peace, and she would not be the one to take it from him, even now, even with the most powerful man in the room standing just a few feet away. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but not sharp, not angry, just precise, asking one question that cut through everything else. How long had the baby been like this? Am I swallowed? Her throat tight, her voice barely above a whisper as she answered honestly, telling him it had been hours, that no one could calm him, that nothing worked. And the silence returned again, stretching longer this time, but different now. Not filled with tension, but with something closer to thought, something calculating but not cold. And Kang Ji-hyun stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, measured, until he stood close enough to see every detail, the relaxed expression on his son's face, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his small fingers had loosened their grip on nothing and settled into something real. And for the first time since he entered the room, something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough that it changed the space around him, a fraction of something human breaking through the surface of control. And he looked at Mai then, really looked at her, not as staff, not as someone invisible, but as the person holding the only thing in his world that mattered. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of something that had always been there before, asking her a question that did not belong to authority, but to something deeper, something personal. Have you done this before? And Maya's breath caught, her eyes lowering for just a second before she answered, telling him the truth because there was nothing else left to say, telling him about her own child, 2 months old, left behind so she could work, left behind, because she did not have another choice. And the words settled between them, simple, unadorned, carrying more weight than anything else in the room. And Kang Ji-hyun did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting back to his son, then back to her, as if measuring something that could not be quantified. And finally, after a silence that felt longer than it was, he gave a small nod, not approval, not permission, but acknowledgement, and stepped back, just one step, creating space instead of taking control, his voice steady when he spoke again. telling her to continue. And that was all. No threat, no reprimand, just a decision made in the quietest way possible. And I felt something shift inside her again. Not relief, not yet, but the understanding that whatever happened next, this moment had already changed something that could not be undone. The room did not return to noise after his words. It stayed quiet, held together by something fragile and newly formed. And Kang Ji-hyun remained where he stood, no longer an interruption, no longer a threat, but a presence that chose not to interfere, his eyes still on his son, as if trying to memorize what peace looked like, as if this moment was something rare enough to study, and Mai could feel that shift without needing to look again. The absence of pressure, the absence of command, allowing her to focus entirely on the child in her arms, her breathing slowing to match his, her movements gentle, careful, guided by instinct that had been waiting for purpose. And time moved differently then, not measured in seconds or minutes, but in the steady rhythm of a baby finally at rest, the kind of rhythm that softened everything around it, even the sharp edges of a man who had built his life on control. And when the child finished, his small body settling into a deeper sleep, Mai adjusted him carefully, making sure he was comfortable, making sure nothing disturbed the calm that had taken so long to reach, and only then did she allow herself to shift slightly, her arms lingering just a second longer than necessary, as if letting go would break something. And she placed him gently into the crib, her hands hovering for a moment above him, not touching, just there, ready, protective without needing to act. And behind her, she heard a breath. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind her that she was not alone, that this moment had been witnessed fully, completely. And she slowly turned, her eyes lowering instinctively before meeting his again, unsure of what would follow. Because silence could mean anything in a house like this. And Kang Ji-hyun looked at her with the same steady focus. But something had changed. Something that made the space between them feel less like a divide and more like a connection that neither of them had expected. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the authority it usually held. It was quieter, almost reflective, asking her how long she had been working here, a question that did not belong to judgment, but to understanding, and I answered simply, telling him it had only been a few weeks, that she had not intended to break any rules, that she only acted because the baby needed help. And again, the words were plain, unembellished, but they settled with weight, and he nodded. Once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her, his gaze shifting briefly to the crib, then back. And when he spoke again, the decision came without announcement, without explanation, just a quiet statement that carried finality, telling her she would not be returning to her previous duties. And for a split second, her chest tightened, her breath catching as the meaning threatened to settle in the worst possible way. But before fear could take hold, he continued, his voice steady, unchanged, telling her that from now on, she would be responsible for his son, that she would stay close, that she would be available whenever needed. And the words did not rise, did not demand. They simply existed, and that made them heavier, more real. And Mai blinked, the shift so sudden it felt unreal, her mind trying to catch up to what had just been said, to understand how a moment that could have ended everything had instead created something entirely different. And Kang Ji-hyun stepped back once more, giving space again, not as distance, but as recognition. And before turning toward the door, he paused, just long enough to add one more thing, his voice lower now, almost quiet enough to be missed, telling her that no one in this house would question her role. And then he left, the door closing softly behind him, and the room remained exactly as it was, still calm, holding the echo of a decision that had just changed everything without raising its voice. The door closed with a softness that did not match the weight of what had just been decided. And for a moment, Mai did not move, her eyes still fixed on the space where Kang Ji-hyun had stood, as if expecting the moment to reverse itself, as if waiting for someone to walk back in and correct what felt impossible. But no one came, and the room remained quiet, the kind of quiet that settled deep, wrapping around her thoughts, forcing them to slow, to catch up, and she turned back toward the crib, her steps careful, almost hesitant now, as if the ground beneath her had changed, as if she no longer knew exactly where she stood, and inside the crib the baby slept peacefully, his face relaxed, his breathing steady, untouched by the shift that had just altered everything around him. And she stood there for a long second, watching him, making sure the calm was real, that it would hold, that this was not just a brief pause before the storm returned, but it stayed, it held, and something. Inside her eased just slightly, enough for her shoulders to lower, enough for her breath to come easier. And then the reality began to settle in, slow and heavy, not as fear, not as relief, but as something in between, something uncertain, because she understood what had just happened. She understood the position she had been placed in, and more importantly, she understood the man who had made that decision. A man who did not speak twice, who did not change his mind, and that made everything more real, more permanent. And as she stood there, the weight of it pressed against her, not crushing, but undeniable. And then there was a knock, soft but deliberate, followed by the door opening just enough for one of the guards to step inside, his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes giving away something else, something like confusion, like he was trying to understand what had changed without being told. And he looked at her, not dismissing her, not questioning. Her just waiting, as if the rules he had followed minutes ago no longer applied the same way. And Maid met his gaze for a brief second before lowering hers again, not out of fear this time, but out of habit, and he spoke quietly, asking if the baby was finally calm, and she nodded, her voice soft but steady as she confirmed it, and the man glanced toward the crib, his shoulders easing just slightly, a breath leaving him that he had probably been holding longer than he realized, and then he hesitated, just for a second, before speaking again, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly as he addressed her, no longer with instruction, but with acknowledgement, telling her that if she needed anything, she should let them know, that the staff had been informed of the change, and the words hung there, simple but significant, confirming what she had not yet fully processed, that her role had shifted in the eyes of everyone in this house, not just in the eyes of one man. And when he stepped back and left, closing the door behind him, the room returned to stillness once more, but it was not the same. Stillness as before, it carried awareness now, recognition, and Maid stood there alone again, but not in the same way she had been before, not invisible, not unnoticed, and she looked at her hands, the same hands that had been scrubbing floors just hours ago, the same hands that had now been trusted with something far more fragile, far more important, and she slowly sat down beside the crib again, her movements quieter now, more deliberate, as if she was stepping into something that required care. Not just in action, but in presence and outside the room, the house continued as it always had, silent, controlled, unchanged, but inside, something had shifted in a way that could not be seen, only felt, and for the first time since she arrived, Maid understood that she was no longer just surviving in this place. She was now part of something that would not let her remain unseen. Morning arrived slowly, not with noise or urgency, but with a soft gray light filtering through the tall windows, settling gently across the nursery, as if careful not to disturb what had finally been restored. And Maid had not moved far from where she sat, her body leaning slightly against the chair, her eyes opening before she even realized she had drifted into sleep. The kind of light rest that comes when responsibility does not allow full surrender. And the first thing she did was look at the crib, her breath catching for a brief second until she saw him there, still peaceful, still steady, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that now felt familiar. And she exhaled quietly, a breath she had been holding even in sleep. And for a moment, she simply watched him, letting the calm settle deeper into her, grounding her in something real, something that did not shift as quickly as everything else had. And then the door opened softly, not abruptly, not as an interruption, but as something expected, and Kang Jae-hyun stepped inside, dressed as he always was, composed, controlled, but there was something different in the way he paused just inside the room, his gaze moving first to his son, confirming what he needed to see before anything else, and only then shifting toward her. And again, there were no immediate words, no commands, just a quiet, observation that filled the space between them, and Mai stood slowly, instinctively, her posture straightening, her hands folding lightly in front of her, as if returning to something familiar, something safe, but he did not acknowledge the formality, did not respond to it the way others might have. Instead, he stepped closer to the crib, his attention fully on the child, and for a long second he simply stood there, looking, as if measuring something that had changed overnight, something he could not fully explain. And then he reached down, carefully, not with uncertainty, but with intention, lifting his son into his arms, holding him close, not awkwardly, not distantly, but with a quiet precision that spoke of practice, of effort, and the baby stirred slightly but did not wake, remaining calm, remaining settled, and that alone seemed to confirm everything that had happened the night before. And Kang Ji-hyun's shoulders lowered just a fraction, a shift so small it would have been missed by anyone not watching closely. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, not weakened, but softened in a way that did not fit the image most people had of him, asking her how long the baby had slept, and Mai answered quietly, telling him it had been hours without interruption, that he had not cried once, and again silence followed, but this time it carried something else, something closer to relief, though it was never spoken, and he nodded once, absorbing the information, holding on to it as if it mattered more than anything else waiting for him outside that room. And then, after a moment, he looked at her again, not as a superior, not as someone evaluating, but as someone trying to understand something unfamiliar. And he asked her another question, simple, direct, whether she would be able to continue, whether she could remain in this role without hesitation. And Mai felt the weight of it immediately, not as pressure, but as responsibility, and she did not answer right away, not because she doubted, but because she understood what yes would mean. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, grounded in something deeper than fear, telling him that she would do whatever the child needed. And this time, when Kang Ji-hyun nodded, it was not just acknowledgement. It was acceptance, a quiet agreement that did not require anything more. And he adjusted his hold on his son slightly, his gaze softening again for just a moment before returning to its usual calm, controlled state. But the difference remained subtle but undeniable, and as the morning light continued to rise, filling the room with a warmth that had not been there before, it became clear that what had changed the night before had not faded with the dark. It had stayed, settled, and begun to take shape in ways neither of them could fully define yet. The rest of the house did not adjust as quickly as the nursery had, and that difference became clear before the morning was even fully settled, because outside that room, the rules still existed, the hierarchy still held, and people who had spent years understanding exactly where they stood were now being asked to accept something that had no precedent, and it showed in the way conversations paused when Mai walked past, in the way eyes followed her just a second longer than before, not openly, disrespectful, not questioning out loud, but searching, trying to place her in a system that no longer fit. And she felt it immediately, the shift in attention, the subtle weight of being seen in a place where she had once been invisible, and it made every step more deliberate, every movement more aware. Because she knew what they were thinking even if they did not say it. She knew how quickly roles could be challenged when they were not understood. And yet, no one stopped her, no one corrected her, because one thing in that house mattered more than assumption, and that was his word. And his word had already been given, and back upstairs, the nursery remained unchanged, a quiet center in a place that thrived on control. And Kang Jae-hyun stood near the window now, his son resting against his shoulder, the city stretching out below him in long lines of glass and steel. But his attention was not on any of it. It was on the steady weight in his arms, the small presence that had caused more disruption in a single night than anything else had in years. And he adjusted his hold slightly, his movements careful, practiced now, but still attentive, as if he was learning something new with each passing moment. And when Mai stepped back into the room, he noticed immediately, not turning right, away, but aware in the way he always was. And after a second, he spoke, his voice calm, asking her what the baby would need next. Not as an order, but as a question that assumed she knew the answer, and that alone shifted something again. subtle but important, because it was not authority directing action, it was trust acknowledging it. Emma answered quietly, explaining the timing, the rhythm she had observed. The way the baby responded not just to feeding, but to presence, to calm, to consistency. And as she spoke, Kang Ji-hyun listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just absorbing, as if the details mattered in a way that extended beyond routine. And when she finished, he nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried more meaning than words. And then he did something that no one else in the house would have expected. He stepped closer and placed the baby gently back in her arms, not hesitantly, not as a test, but with full intention, and the child settled. Almost immediately, as if recognizing the shift without needing to understand it. And for a moment, Kang Ji-hyun did not step away. He remained there, close enough to see the change, to confirm it, his gaze steady, focused, and then, after a few seconds, he spoke again, quieter this time, telling her that a room would be prepared nearby, that she would not be placed back with the rest of the staff, that her schedule would follow the child, not the house. And each word landed with the same calm certainty as before, not dramatic, not emphasized, just final. And I felt the weight of it settle in fully now, not as something uncertain, but as something real, something that had already begun to reshape her place in this world. And as she held the baby, feeling the steady rhythm return once more, she realized that this was no longer about breaking rules or crossing boundaries. It was about something else entirely, something quieter but far more powerful, a shift that did not need to announce itself to change everything around it. And in that room, in the soft light of a morning that had started like any other, a new balance had formed, one built not on status or fear, but on something far more difficult to control and far more impossible to ignore. Days passed, but the silence in the house never returned to what it had been before, because once something invisible becomes seen, it cannot go back to being ignored. And I felt that truth in every quiet glance, every subtle shift in tone, every moment where her presence was acknowledged without being questioned. And yet, none of that mattered inside the nursery, where time moved differently, where the rhythm of the baby defined everything. And she had learned that rhythm now, not through instruction, not through training, but through attention, through care, through something that could not be taught, only felt. And each day the child grew calmer, stronger, more settled, responding not just to what she did, but to how she existed around him, steady, present, constant. And Kang Ji-hyun noticed all of it, even when he said nothing, even when his expression remained unchanged, because he was always watching, always measuring. And this was no different, except this time, what he observed was not weakness or failure. It was something else entirely, something he had not accounted for, something that did not fit into any system he had built. And one evening, as the sun lowered behind the skyline and the city lights began to replace the fading daylight, he stood once again in the doorway of the nursery, not entering immediately, not interrupting, just watching, as I sat quietly beside the crib, humming under her breath, a sound so soft it barely carried, but enough to fill the space with something warm, something human. And the baby responded without even opening his eyes, his breathing evening out, his body relaxing in a sleep, as if the sound itself was enough. And for a long moment, Kang Ji-hyun remained there, still, silent, taking in something he had never allowed himself to recognize before. And when he finally stepped inside, his presence did not disrupt the moment. It joined it, quietly, without force. And I looked up, her expression calm, no longer uncertain the way it had been before, and neither of them spoke right away, because nothing needed to be said, not yet. And then, after a few seconds, he moved closer, his gaze shifting from his son to her. And there was something different there now, something that no longer held distance, no longer held judgment. And when he spoke, his voice was low, but clear, asking her a question that had nothing to do with duty, nothing to do with the house, but everything to do with her, asking if she had seen her own child since she arrived. And the question settled into the room with quiet weight. And I hesitated just for a moment before answering honestly, telling him she had not, that she sent money when she could, that she called when she was allowed, but that it was not the same. And her voice did not break, did not falter, but the truth. And it did not need to, and Kang Ji-hyun listened, really listened, not as someone gathering information, but as someone understanding something that could not be measured. And he nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself. And then he spoke again, his tone unchanged, but his words carrying something deeper than instruction, telling her that arrangements would be made, that her child would be brought here, that she would not have to choose between survival and being a mother. And for the first time since she had entered this house, Mai did not respond immediately, because the words did not feel real, not yet, not something she could hold on to without questioning, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with something that neither of them needed to define, and Kang Ji-hyun did not elaborate, did not explain. He simply turned toward the door once more, pausing only briefly before leaving. And as the door closed behind him, the room remained quiet, unchanged on the surface, but beneath that calm, something irreversible had taken place, something that no longer belonged to power or control, but to something far more human, something that did not demand to be seen. But once it was, could never be forgotten, and that night, in a house where silence had always meant distance, it meant something else entirely. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.